because we have medically or culturally divorced the sexual act from any potential of procreation. Therefore, we pretend as if there is no connection.
And as we said in the last segment, this next question is intimately related with the first question that we answered. And it comes down to why not a committed same-sex marriage, which is the family structure, the quote-unquote family structure that we were discussing in the context of adoption. Now we want to talk about it in the context of whether it's even legitimate, especially for Christians. So this person writes in, I just ordered the book Same-Sex Marriage by Sean McDowell and John Stonestreet. Perhaps it'll answer a question I have, but basically there are many people saying that the Bible says same-sex marriage in a committed monogamous relationship is fine in the Bible and with God. It seems like Sean and John are hinging their argument on procreation, and I like that, but how would you answer then this response? So if marriage is for procreation, then should a couple who is not trying to procreate late in life or who's done having children, then stop having sex? I want to challenge in an apologetic way, I love the book Tactics, those who say homosexuality is fine in the church. Any biblical references and other information would be appreciated.
So yeah, I think the book Same-Sex Marriage will be helpful. We specifically address this question, and I'm always amazed by remembering David Noble, who wrote this massive tome on worldview called Understand the Times, that at its biggest point was like 900 pages. And when a student would ask him a question, he would say, go to Understand the Times, page 74. And I was just like, what? By matter of comparison, the Same-Sex Marriage book is 140 pages, and I couldn't tell you even what chapter this answer is in because I've forgotten the layout. I will say, though, that what we tried to do in that book is a couple things. We tried to take some of the most important biblical and natural law arguments on marriage and boil them down and make them understandable and repeatable. And second is that point of using both natural law and biblical reference. So your last point about from the question is biblical references or any biblical reference or other information would be appreciated. You should be able to get the answer both from a natural law perspective and from biblical reference. Let me try to hit it really quick. It is not true that we hinge our argument on procreation. It is true that what we do is we hinge our argument on the created nature, the observable realities of sex. Now, that's different in two ways because procreation is a consequence. It is a result. It's a product of the natural process that's already there. So it shouldn't be separated, and one of the things we try to do is bring the reality of procreation back into the conversation about marriage, family, and sexuality, because we have been talking about it since the sexual revolution as if it's irrelevant. Because we have medically or culturally divorced the sexual act from any potential of procreation, therefore we pretend as if there is no connection. But there is a connection and it needs to be considered. But there's a connection because of the natural kind of act that sex is, which gets to the heart of the question, and it goes right back to Shane, to your point, which is we can't just stamp a label on it and call it the same. So, for example, one of the things that culturally drove the sexual revolution in its more recent chapters was this meme, which was also a slogan, which also became a terrible song that became popular by a guy named Macklemore, called Same Love. And the idea is that heterosexual love and homosexual love are the same. That is, on its face, not true unless you assume the body is irrelevant to the conversation. Strictly speaking, if we take the body seriously, two women and two men can do sexually erotic things. They can behave in sexually erotic ways with each other, but they cannot have sex.
Right. It's a name game even to say they can.
Well, it is. And and it's so hard because, it depends on what point you're trying to make and having a conversation. And I've been doing this for so many years with high schoolers, and you just and it takes them a while to think about it. Because it's just been so assumed that the thing that equates heterosexual love and homosexual love is either the common erotic drive or the feelings of attachment
Yeah.
or the intense, connection. In other words, as if there are no bodies. This is why we continue over and over and over and over and over to talk about how the sexual revolution is a form of Gnosticism, because it treats the body as if it doesn't matter.
Yeah, this is the move that Matthew Vines makes in God and the Gay Christian, where he tries to redefine marriage biblically. But briefly, his project is an attempt to basically shoehorn same-sex marriage into the Bible and argue as a liberal evangelical that it works, that Paul wasn't talking about committed same-sex relationships and such, and that's the argument that's being made here. But his move in order to do that is to radically redefine marriage as this covenant of strong feelings, basically, between two people. Completely take bodies out of the picture, natural procreation, any of that, completely out of the picture. It's now just a relationship of strong sexual feelings between two people.
And the other part of this too, Shane, which is important, and is that he does it also by attacking all the so-called clobber passages. In other words, all the passages that very clearly and obviously say that homosexual sex is wrong, and then always say that what it's referring to is abusive relationships, because in that culture, pederasty and sexual violence was common, and there was no understanding of committed sexual relationships. Now, just so people know, and I know we're off topic here specifically, but you can see how it all swirls around, is that liberal, progressive, pro-same-sex marriage theologians have said, yeah, that's just not true. Culturally speaking, there was an understanding of loving committed same-sex relationships, and the Bible's still talking about all of those, and it's pretty clear. But that's what, folks like Matthew Vines and many, it's just popular. It's just one of those things too, where it's been so thoroughly discredited, and yet it continues to get said. I think the idea is that most people aren't biblical scholars, so if we say it over and over and over again, people will get over it and just think that we're right.
Yeah, if you throw Matthew Vines' arguments about the Greek at your Baptist grandma, she's not going to be able to answer them, and you'll feel like you've justified yourself.
Yeah. So, let's go back to the question: does the fact that there is an inherent connection between sex and procreation, is that something that means then that Christians should stop having sex? Now, there have been Christians throughout history that believe that. You have that view in Augustine. Some more extreme Catholic thinkers said the same thing. I don't think. Well, I think there's two things at work here. Number one is a non-Gnostic or an anti-Gnostic theology, in which God sees the created order that He made as good, and its capacities and functions as good. And as Jesus came not to condemn it, but actually to restore it as good, then there's nothing fundamentally wrong with the creation doing what the creation does. So, for example, the sexual process is fundamentally for procreation, but it's not exclusively for procreation. C.S. Lewis talked about the difference between primary ends and secondary ends, primary purposes and secondary purposes. You have to keep the primary purpose, or the secondary purpose falls apart. When you try to make a secondary purpose a primary purpose, then the whole thing falls apart. So sex, primarily, is how God established the promulgation and the long, term security of the species, right? That's why it's not just a Christian thing, it's a human thing. But sex is also for pleasure. And the Scripture makes no bones about that. Just read Song of Solomon. There's an enjoyment of it. I always thought that it was super cool, because as I studied that whole Genesis passage, when you think about what God was trying to do, solve this problem, this thing that was not good in His creation before the fall, which is a remarkable language thing happening in Genesis 1 and 2. It says it's not good that man's alone, because I want him to be fruitful and multiply, and he can't do it by himself. And then He tells him to go name the animals. And after He names the animals, it's like, of all the creatures in the field, He couldn't find a helper. Now, what did Adam need help doing? Filling the planet. And so no animal, as helpful as animals are, I always joke about this with kids. I'm like, animals are super helpful. They pull our plows, they give us clothes, they give us bacon. Animals are great, right? But they're not suitable help. And you know what else would not have been a suitable helper for Adam? Another Adam. But in allowing Adam,
This is why I don't make fun of the whole he made Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve thing, because that's an unintentionally shrewd natural law argument.
well, you have to go into it. But,
Yeah.
but see, here's the problem: is that Christians that are saying that are Gnostic.
Yeah.
In other words, they're saying that if you see marriage and human sexual relationships as fundamentally a function of our emotions, disconnected from our bodies and our created design, then it's just observably not true to say that Adam and Steve can't feel as strongly about each other as Adam and Eve. The point I'm trying to make is that Adam and Eve have different bodies that together help each other. Another way to say this is every biological function your body can do, it does on its own, unless you have a disability, right? You don't need help circulating or respirating or digesting. Whenever you need help digesting, it's such a bad day, right? But you always need help procreating. And another Adam couldn't have helped an Adam. Only an Eve could have helped an Adam. And even when Adam and Eve come together and have sex, but there's not a product, doesn't mean that the procreative system didn't work. It worked. It just didn't produce the product. So it's a different way of seeing it. It's seeing the world in these relationships as if the created order actually matters, and, to Christopher West's point, can teach us as a form of natural revelation. We treat the physical world as pliable to our desires. The idea here is that the world has something to teach us. It has something to teach us about God. Our bodies are a form of natural revelation, maybe the highest of natural revelation. When Jesus Christ takes on human flesh, now we've got the natural revelation and special revelation merging in the most amazing thing in human history. So that's why. Now, on a legal basis, to go back to the question, to allow a couple to get together in which one is infertile. Now, most of the time, by the way, you don't know. So there's not really a way to pass a law that says you can't marry someone who's infertile because sex is about procreation. I mean, that would be crazy because you'd have to test everyone and it just wouldn't work out. But there are some cases where you know, right? There's been a hysterectomy. There's been some disease. Maybe, either the woman is past childbearing age. But there's nothing in allowing that infertile couple to get married that violates the way everything is. Mm-hmm. The moment two men or two women's relationship, their sexual relationship is sanctioned by the state and equated to a heterosexual relationship, you are putting in law that there's no fundamental connection between marriage and the sexual act, and between marriage and procreation.
Yeah, a man and a woman who are past childbearing age and get married are not denying created reality in the way that a man and a man who are at any age and who want to call their relationship a marriage are denying it. That man and the woman are still on the human continuum on which reproduction takes place from,
the sexual act still happens, right? It still actually happens. Now, you could ask questions if there's some sort of severe disability that doesn't allow that coital act to actually take place between a man and a woman.
I would classify that as like a wisdom issue.
Yeah.
Just ask those questions.
It's just, you don't make policy based on those exceptions. Yeah. And that's actually the point, is we're making policy based on the grandest exception of all, that is two men or two women.
I go back to this, so many of the assumptions that are at play here just never get questioned. And Carl Trueman's book has me thinking in terms of those unquestioned assumptions and how they build on one another and create a narrative that just becomes inescapable in the end because we've given away the whole ballgame from the beginning. And I think that the equation of homosexuality as a thing with heterosexuality as a thing is one of the key assumptions that we have going into this conversation that makes it difficult even for Christians to sort of answer questions like this. Well, why not a committed same-sex couple? Well, we have to again ask what marriage is. What is a family? What does it mean to be a family? We can't just slap a label on it. There was this a terrific article a few years ago in First Things that we referred to recently in the podcast. It was by Michael Hannon, and it was called Against heterosexuality. And I want to read this one little excerpt from it because he makes this point just stunningly. And it's something that I hadn't even thought about up to that point because I was assuming these categories. He goes, over the course of several centuries, the West had progressively abandoned Christianity's marital architecture for human sexuality. Then, about 150 years ago, it began to replace the long-standing teleological tradition with a brand new creation, the absolutist but absurd taxonomy of sexual orientations. Heterosexuality was made to serve as this fanciful framework's regulating ideal, preserving the social prohibitions against sodomy and other sexual debaucheries without requiring recourse to the procreative nature of human sexuality. On this novel account, same-sex acts were wrong not because they spurned the rational animal purpose of sex, namely the family, but rather because the desire for these actions allegedly arises from a distasteful psychological disorder. As queer theorist Han Blank recounts, this new concept of heterosexuality, gussied up in a mangled mix of impressive-sounding dead languages, gave old orthodoxies a new and vibrant lease on life by suggesting, in authoritative tones, that science had effectively pronounced them natural, inevitable, and innate. So, don't miss what's going on here. Heterosexuality was invented as a category in order to safeguard the traditional ideal of man and woman in psychological terms rather than in natural, moral, and philosophical terms. And Hannon's contention in that article, his argument is that move, even though it was at first intended by those who made it to protect quote-unquote heterosexuality, ended up opening the door wide for these new categories, homosexuality chief among them, being equated with heterosexuality. But once you abandon that ancient framework of man and woman coming together in a procreative, unitive marriage, and that being what the core of the family is, you've opened the door wide for redefinition and
Right.
that sort of nominalistic name slapping that we talked about earlier.
To be clear, you use the word ancient not in the sense that it was invented in an ancient culture and is
Right.
dependent on an ancient time,
Yes.
but ancient in the terms of this is the way people have recognized the world works and still do or still should. In other words, it goes way back, not that it's grounded in an ancient culture with ancient assumptions or anything like that. And I think that's what's often we're accused of. But
well, sex is. I like that. I like the way of expressing it. As designed for a unitive and a procreative function. And the procreative function we can give priority and so forth as the means of filling the earth and being fruitful and subduing it. But there's another formulation that I found to be even more useful, and that is that sex is designed to create the family. It is just the glue that creates a family. It's the spark. It's the fuel. It's the thing that literally brings man and woman together bodily and in their fullness, and then that's a family. I mean, that's a marriage is a family, but it also has this wonderful potential in most cases to bring children into the mix. And so let's
be clear what you mean by unitive, because again, it's like, I tell this to folks all the time. They're like, because usually when that passage is preached in Genesis, it's not good that man's alone.
It's a companionate spin.
Yeah. It's not good that man's lonely, so I'll make him someone to keep him company. None of that's what the text says.
Well, the animals could have done a lot of that pretty effectively,
Well, he was hanging out with God. His emotional state was probably pretty stable.
Yeah.
No, you remember what Jesus says when the Pharisees come and ask him about divorce. And he goes back. What's fascinating is he goes back. They ask a question about the law. This is one of the most fascinating passages. They ask a question about the law. Jesus takes them back to the garden. In other words, they say, did Moses mean this or did Moses mean that? And they're like, look, what was true from the beginning is three things. God made them male and female. And so you walk through that and it answers so much of the story. And the two shall become one flesh, and I'll come back to that in just a second, and then what God's put together, let no man separate. The third is the natural answer to the conclusion of the first two. And Jesus takes them back not to a legal nuance or a law that says, well, this is okay and not that, but he takes them back to the design. But the key part is that second one, or one of the key things is that second one. He doesn't say the two shall become one emotionally, or the two shall become a team, It's the two shall become one flesh. And a man and a woman, even if the woman is postmenopausal, or a man has, had to be sterilized for medical reasons or non-medical reasons or whatever, a man and a woman still become one flesh. Two women do not become one flesh. Two men do not become one flesh. It actually doesn't happen. So anyway, man,
that was a good
that
discussion.
was a lot.
Yeah,
No, it's a great question, and it's at the heart of so much. But it just reveals, as you said, how much definitional baggage has been heaped on this issue.
Yeah, questions can get you to the heart of that and figure out what assumptions are being made and what assumptions need to be questioned.